This concludes my Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn playthrough, completed after defeating the final boss 1000 times in a row. I believe this is a new world record, but that's probably because nobody has ever had the motivation to do this before. And now for some final thoughts on the game. Radiant Dawn is a interesting game with many unique and ambitious features and memorable moments. But despite this, the game is marred by major problems in its core gameplay loop and map design that make actually playing the game not as enjoyable. Aside from the generally slow pace of its gameplay, training and using characters is both difficult and unrewarding because so many characters have very low or extremely inconsistent availability. And I think that this is because the game prioritizes using maps for narrative purposes instead of actually being interesting from a gameplay perspective. So many maps are filled with large preset deployments of overpowered crutch units. This generally reduces the variability of experiences and replayability of many early game maps, especially in Part 1 and Part 2. As a result, a lot of the game feels very on rails, where your actions don't really affect future outcomes. This is made worse by the fact that Part 3 is basically a hard reset in terms of progress once you get the girl mercenaries, who outclass basically everyone you get before them. It really feels like every time you play Radiant Dawn, you're forced to play two separate side stories before you actually get to play the real game. It's like if every Fire Emblem 7 playthrough required that you went through two mandatory Lyn mode sections before you get to play Eliwood or Hector mode. I think that would overall harm the gameplay experience. Part 3 is undoubtedly the most interesting section of the game, culminating in the parts where you play as both sides of the conflict between the Dawn Brigade and the Guild of Mercenaries. This is probably one of the most interesting dynamics introduced into a Fire Emblem game, needing to toe the power balance between your two armies, even if it is ultimately illusory. In the various Guild Mercenary versus Dawn Brigade maps, you don't actually have to fight your own characters unless you specifically go out of your way to do so. And then after that, Part 4 has a very unique three-way army split, but sadly these split army chapters feature some of the most uninspired map design in the game. Maybe this is controversial, but I'm generally not a fan of big flat open plain route maps where you have to fight 60 to 100 enemies. I would say that the game picks up again with the end game in the Tower of Guidance, mostly because you have more control over your army, but even then, more than a third of your units are mandatory deployments. And that said, I do think Ashera is a very satisfying final boss just because the effort you need to defeat her is quite high compared to other games in the series. All in all, I have mixed feelings about Radiant Dawn because it's a game that has so many interesting mechanics that reward long-term planning, but it constantly undercuts the value of your effort. The simple fact is, the game doesn't let you use the characters that you want to use, which is something that you can basically take for granted in nearly every other Fire Emblem game. Aside from a couple of exceptions, typically once you get a character, you can use them until the end of the game. But in Radiant Dawn, nearly every character drops in and out of availability so frequently that it is honestly disorienting. I think it's a major problem that so many characters are simply not worth investing resources into because they will leave for several chapters and then be outclassed by newly joined units when they return. But all that said, I think the final boss alone allows for an unprecedented amount of shenanigans and nonsense unmatched by any other Fire Emblem game. The lack of an upper end to the bullshit you can display in the final map is quite something, and that alone makes contriving a game-spanning plan to defeat Ashera 1000 times worth the effort, and I think there's something special about that. Anyway, thanks for watching, and if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe or consider donating to my Patreon or becoming a YouTube member. See you all in the next one. Bye.